Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Face2Face. Today's session is Art, Abolition, and Radical Imagination as Sites and Sites of Educational Transformation. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Megan. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Chinese American person with medium dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt. I am the conference coordinator for the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. The Roundtable is a grassroots service organization working to improve and advance the state of arts education through professional development workshops, advocacy, and online resources and platforms to connect the arts education field. Although we are currently meeting via an online platform, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we work and live on stolen land. The place that we call New York City exists on the traditional, ancestral, unceded land of the Canarsie, Lenape, Munsee, and Wappinger people. We'd like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black and immigrant communities which have helped build the city we know today. As we travel in their footsteps, we recognize that all of our past, presents, and futures are intertwined. Thank you. I just want to share a few reminders. If you are having trouble with Zoom, please send me or Programming and Membership Manager Kinsey Keck a private message. You can also refer to our Zoom one sheet, which will be pasted in the chat. This is a webinar, so you don't need to worry about turning your microphone or camera on or off. We encourage you to use the chat box to share resources and connect with other participants. Resources shared in the chat box transcript will be saved and shared in a follow-up email in the coming days. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the toolbar to ask questions, which we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. Closed captioning is included in the main room. To activate this setting, please click the live transcript button on your toolbar and select Show Subtitles. This session is being recorded, and we will make it available on the Roundtable website, YouTube, and Vimeo channels. We are grateful for the generosity of our conference sponsors, Disney, National Dance Institute, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our facilitators today. Dr. Joni Boyd Acuff is an associate professor of art education at The Ohio State University. She serves as Graduate Studies Chair and Diversity Chair in the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy, where her goal has been to recruit, admit, and retain students from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds. Ashley Y. Lipscomb is the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Anti-Racist Education, Inc., and she has experience working with, motivating, and advocating for students and educators. Turning it over to our facilitators.
Hello, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. I am Ashley, she, her. I'm honoring the Lenni Lenape here where I am in their lands, and I'm grateful for them. Feel free to share in the chat whose land you are honoring today in this space. I also encourage us to be mindful of how we will hold ourselves accountable to these communities. And it's my pleasure to present today with Dr. Joni. So I'm gonna let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Joni Acuff. I am here in Columbus, Ohio, colonially known as Columbus, Ohio, but on the lands of Miamia and Hopewell Indigenous peoples. I'm so excited to be here with you all today and to work with Ashley on this webinar. It's been so great to get to know her, and really, I think we've come up with a really engaging webinar for you today. So thank you all for taking the time this morning to come here.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure working with you as well. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's hope I do this right, because I usually mess things up, which I just did. It's okay though. All right, so our session today, Art, Abolition, and Radical Imagination as sites of educational transformation. And so I invite us to think about this question. What is the state of education in 2021? I invite you to think about that and And then put it into the chat because we'd love to hear you. We'd love to hear what you believe the state of education is right now. So let's do that. Put that in the chat. I'll read them out. Can everyone see the screen here? Oh, okay, wonderful. So I see some of your responses as they are jumping in. Some are saying shifting and evolving, surface level changes to an old colonial system. Woo! Dynamic, some say troubled, coupled with innovation, in need of change and purpose. Eve says seriously lacking. Feel that. Jillian says troubled, but maybe an inflection point. That's an interesting way to enter. Stevie reminds us teachers aren't given the tools to succeed and are often overlooked when it comes to funding and support. Bella tells us still failing too many students and so many more. So in these responses, one thing that's standing out to me is that all of us can admit that education needs to change. That where we are right now, it's not where we ought to be. And we can admit here today that education must change. And so here we are. Instead of 2021, white supremacy culture is permeating in our schools. And so what is white supremacy culture? I start here with these two definitions supported by, number one, Emily Shore-Lesnick is a facilitator with the Institute. And she says that white supremacy is a belief that white people are superior to non-white people, can be explicit or implicit, explicitly connected to anti-Black racism. Sonia Renee Taylor, author of The Body is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love, says white supremacist delusions relies on amnesia to survive. It's got to forget what it does, what it creates, who is harmed in order to continue to perpetuate itself. And so I ask you in the chat, again, let's go ahead and engage the chat. What is white supremacy culture in schools? Can we provide examples of how that shows up in our classrooms, how it shows up in policy? I'd love to hear what you think. Let's add that in the chat now. Out the gate, Jillian, thank you, says perfectionism. Real quick, it was not a second thought. Yeah. Ooh, Emily. Emily says children's bodies are being policed. Adultification of Black girls. Someone says, Krista says, the way history is taught in schools. Wendy, excessive punitive measures. David tells us white teachers predominantly teaching and yelling at Black and brown children. Ooh, Brooklyn Arts Council, white supremacy in schools, regmentation, of time and knowledge. Using texts that center white folks and white folks only. Differences in resources from school to schools in the same district. Colleen tells us teachers are the supreme source of knowledge and no room for questioning. And one thing I'm trying to work on as well, Tracy, emphasis on testing as a measure for knowledge and learning. And think about how painful that is during a pandemic. I'm gonna just drop that right there. And so in all of this, what we see is that white supremacy culture, white supremacist culture in schools is continuing to really to permeate education, right? And in that, because that is happening, that tells us then that not every person in education is thriving. White supremacy culture in schools results in the spirit murdering of Black and Brown students, families, educators, counselors, staff, and administrators. I know that we tend to think that this bias or that white supremacy only affects Black and Brown students. But as a former Black educator, I can attest to the fact that I too experienced a lot of these painful realities because of what schools have been conditioned to do. And so as we do this work, as we enter, as we think about this, I encourage us to be mindful of the fact that students are not the only ones being harmed. The ones that we work with, that we care for, the families that we interact with, that it goes beyond just students. So in this space, I'm encouraging us to think about the ways in which not everyone is thriving. And Dr. Bettina Love says here, offers these two questions. How are children's imagination and humanity stunted by the notion that they are never safe in their schools because of the color of their skin or the God they pray to? Where does the soul go to heal when school is a place of trauma? Those questions for me struck me. And so I want you to engage in the chat here. As you read these questions, what does it do for you? What thoughts come up for you as you read these questions offered by Dr. Love? Go ahead and share that out in the chat. And if it's okay, I would love to actually hear someone's voice here to kind of, is it okay, Kinsey, if we get a participant to vocally share out? If you would like to vocally share out for us, I invite you to just raise your hand and we'd love to hear you here.
Yes, and if you don't know how to raise your hand, which is on the bottom of your toolbar, you can just type it in the chat. I will find you and I will invite you to come off of mute.
Thank you. Where does the soul go to heal when school is a place of trauma?
Hello.
Hi.
This question is really deep and I was contemplating it. One thing that I would say is family is a part of the support, but a lot of the times, I deal with suicidal prevention. A lot of the times, students, including myself, have gone through, thoughts of not feeling good enough. And that requires someone to kind of separate themselves from that space. And like a lot of people are dropping out of school because of this. So I think the soul tries to come back to itself and tries to heal itself, but it doesn't have a place to go but back to its community. So it's very important that, education is, a place that students can go. But if that's not the place, like, if they don't have that at home, if they don't have that at school, they're kind of lost in between. So yeah, I think thoughts start to occur, certain things. I don't want to assume that would be something that students do, but I have had situations where my students come to me with like really, I guess I want to say suicidal thoughts, but a lot of the times it depends. And I have been, in situations where I have been able to prevent these things by just having a talk and being patient and trying to understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for offering that here. When we think about that, right? When we think about how students have to find their way back, how students have to, can everyone see my screen here? Sorry about that. When we think about the ways in which not every child is thriving, and the result is, how do they find home, right? How are they even defining home? And you bring that up for us in this space. So thank you so much for sharing out here. And when I think about how not every person is thriving, some of the results of white supremacy culture, we see across the country that American Indian and Alaska Native students are disciplined more than most other racial groups. And they have a dropout rate twice the national average. Plus, the suicide rate among Native teens is 1.5 times higher than the national average, according to the CDC. Punitive school discipline in this country have criminalized Black girls as young as 6 or 7 years old. LGBTQ students who had experienced LGBT-related discrimination were more than 3 times as likely to miss school on a continual basis because they feel unsafe or uncomfortable. Students and staff members continue to face religious marginalization and microaggressions across schools. Ableism and ableist policies continue to silence, erase, punish, and push students out of schools. Black students are 2 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from schools than their white peers. Houseless students continue to struggle in our schools and are deprived of social and emotional support. White supremacy culture is spirit murdering our kids. And at this point, it has to end. So when do we say to ourselves, something must be done? Abolition. Abolition as a site of reimagining. And so before I continue here in this space, I want to hear from you. How do you define abolition? I love defining things because I want to make sure we're starting on the same page here. Right? A lot of these terms mean a lot of different things. So we need to have a shared common understanding of how we are approaching these terms. As the co-founder of the Institute for Anti-Racist Education, I am aware that anti-racism in and of itself has been commodified. So then how do we identify and define anti-racism? I have to do that on a continual basis. So I want to hear from you. How are you defining abolition? And I see it coming in the chat already. So let's see. Someone says I can relate. I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat, right? Sorry. Emily says using funding to prioritize spirit wholeness, not spirit controlling. Okay. Monique says eradicating the systems that oppress us. Anyone else? Is there a hand raised? Anyone want to share out verbally how they define abolition? Jillian says transforming the systems. A turn to community-based mutual support and safety. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hello. Sorry, I think I was asked to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. When I think of abolition, I think of the eradication of dehumanization and things that dehumanize, or, the abolition of slavery. The idea that people are not completely whole and that they are half or fragmented parts, right? Like the idea that slaves were 33% a person, and then we had to work to become 100%, and we're still working to become 100% whole human beings. So seeing students and educators as whole human beings showing up completely who they are is a part of abolition to me. It's eradicating the idea that students are less, or anybody is less than whole.
Thank you for that. And I want to say your name correctly. Is it Melisha?
Yes, Melisha Taylor.
Thank you, Melisha. I appreciate you also joining in and voicing how you define abolition. I think it's a beautiful definition, right? It's focusing on how, not only seeing how we're being dehumanized, but also doing the act of service of really honoring and spotlighting humanity as it ought to be. And I thank you for offering that definition in this space. And then so many of you are also being really active in the chat. So I don't want to miss out on some of the wonderful definitions that you all are putting there. So I encourage you to read them, to hold them, and to acknowledge them here. But as I continue, I think about, yes, your definitions hold true for me, in that a lot of you have already stated what abolition is to you and what it means. But for me, when I think about abolition and what abolition can do, right? Schooling institutions are a universal safety net, right? Dr. Monique Morris tells us that they are places that have just as much, arguably more, influence as any other social factor on how children understand themselves personally and in relation to the world around them. And so schools have the opportunity to create the world we have yet to see, to create a world that we have been dreaming of. We have the possibility to do that in our schools. And so the question then that abolition provides us is, what can we imagine for ourselves in the world? This is a question by Mariam Kaba. If you haven't got her book, I encourage you to go grab We Do This Till We Free Us. And therefore, I use this definition from Mariam Kaba. It says here, the PIC, which is a prison industrial complex, if you are not aware of that, PIC abolition is a vision of restructured society in a world where we have everything we need: food, shelter, education, art, beauty, clean water, and more things that are foundational to our personal, right, and our community safety. Schools have the capabilities of doing just that. Schools can be the sites where transformative justice can happen. Students should be able to have access to quality foods for free, have access to resources when they are houseless, are given clean water, and creating programs that actively provide clean water to their communities. Schools should fight for access for free healthcare. Schools should be the place where students can live and thrive. And for me, that means that not one school has an officer present. Schools can teach repair, healing, and restoration for students as they learn how to advocate and heal their own relationships. If we can't begin with the imagination, and our response to things like take officers out of school is always, well, what about this? What if this happens? If that is our constant response, then schools will continuously spirit murder us. And we have to hold that. And so therefore, if the criminal punishment system is racist, sexist, classist, ableist, unfair, and the list continues to go on, we then have to see that schooling institutions mirror the criminal punishment system. That's why you were able to pick out all of those elements of white supremacy culture. And so if that's the case, I invite us to remember that abolition is our only way forward. So how can art present a framework for what abolition looks like in the classroom? What transformations can come from including art in every single classroom? Today, we begin with art. Art is affirming, loving, and healing. And I end my segment here by saying, art saved my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was a wonderful setup to now delve deeper into the way that arts bring abolition to the fore. You can go back one first. So just FYI, Ashley is running the slides and I'm gonna have to tell her to progress, but go back to the art question. I'll just talk while you go back to the art question. So thank you so much, because I think you establishing that, you know, the state of education right now, and people really honing in and understanding that is systemic. Lot of institutional racism that was called out. And so as I think about the ways that art enter this conversation, it's really around, I'm going to be thinking about the micro level of our spheres of influence as artists, as art educators, and the way that we, while the system may be kind of fudged up right now, but the way that we, as people who see the arts as transformative, can make a difference in our classrooms, can destabilize and push up against the institutions and the systemic racism that we're seeing, the white supremacist culture. And so as we think about sites, I am a visual arts educator, so my frame of reference will be from the visual, but I know there may be other artists in here who do dance and music. So I welcome you to think about the ways that your specific medium may enter this conversation. And so as I think about the arts, I think about the ways that we have learned what race is through imagery, right? So let's just put that out on the table. Race is visually mediated. All the things that you've mentioned in the chats around, policing. Who do we know how to police? And how did we learn how to police them? How do we, for example, I've had students who've noted that they've crossed. I have predominantly white students because I teach undergraduate students who are about to be pre-service teachers. And if you know anything about educators, more than 80% of practicing teachers are white women. And so, I help them reflect. And so they, in one of my students' reflections, she wrote that sometimes, she was honest, saying that she crosses the street. If she sees a man, a Black man, she would cross the street if she saw a Black man. And so we got into the conversation and she mentioned baggy pants. And I'm like, okay, so how did you learn to equate baggy pants with Black men to fear? How did you learn that? How were you socialized to understand that? Seeing baggy pants, that's a visual experience. That's a decoding of your visual environment. And so thinking about the arts and the ways that they play a role in abolition, arts can play a role in white supremacy and abolition. And so let's not be thinking that it's automatically transformative when we use the arts, because arts have been historically used to create ideas around the dehumanization of people of color. And I'm gonna go through that with you today. All right, so you may advance, Ashley. Thank you so much. So I want to introduce you four principles first. So this framework, a colleague and I are working on a book. It should be out soon, in June, actually. Hallelujah. And in it, we talk about this framework for abolition in the art classroom. And we created this framework because, when we think about how we come up with curriculum, there are a lot of different ways that places we can pull from. But when we think about anti-racist and abolitionist pedagogy, we see these things here: political clarity, protective care, deep connection and witnessing. We see these as places that will allow us to have a starting place for understanding the ways that we want our role as art educators to impact our students. And you see here, although they hold their own space on this screen, they're actually really interdependent. One reinforces the other. It's a holistic teaching practice, So art educators can draw from them when thinking about practical matters like what artists and artworks to feature in the curriculum, what kind of big ideas and enduring questions to use when you're thinking about your curriculum, how to engage students with interpreting works of art, and how to recognize and assess student learning. Like, how do we assess learning? Are we thinking about the different ways that they understand media? Are we thinking about neurodiversity in the way when we introduce things? And so a coherent set of guiding principles like this is really important, because it's what orients an art teacher's advanced planning and even their on-the-spot decision making. And so I'm going to start out with just sharing a little bit about each one. And so the first one I offer here for you is political clarity. So anti-racist pedagogy is grounded in political clarity. And political clarity is an awareness of the political aspects of education, the things that you've talked about today when we established the state of schooling today, and the ways that schools actually reproduce social inequalities. So, but more specific to the arts, art teachers who practice anti-racist pedagogy understand their teaching in the context of the K-20 through college art education system that's uneven and inequitable based on race, class, gender, just access. So political clarity enables anti-racist art teachers to see themselves and their teaching as a part of a larger historical struggle for racial and social justice in the arts and through arts education. And they reflect on the ways that whiteness and racial hierarchies influence their teaching practice and conditioned their own education, right? Whether teaching directly about racism or making pedagogical decisions, they employ methods that are effective at empowering students to be actively and critically engaged in their own learning and knowledge construction, rather than passive repositories of knowledge already made. So methods of continually critiqued and revised for clarity, greater efficacy, and responsiveness to real world conditions. So if we think about political clarity, if you had that at the fore of your pedagogy, you would see maybe the insurrection as a teachable moment. You would see the mass shootings as a teachable moment. So your political clarity informing your pedagogy would place these events at the fore of how you engage with the arts and engage with your students as humans. And so then that moves us to protective care. By definition, racism is systemic, it's pervasive. Students are destined to be targets of or witnesses to racial inequity, discrimination, violence. And those experiences can occur in and out of the art classroom. So although art teachers can't end all racism, obviously, they can intervene by bringing their political clarity to bear in protecting students, right? So the principle of protective care is integral to anti-racist pedagogy. It's not about creating a colorblind bubble in which, discussions of race are avoided completely. That is neither caring nor protective in a world structured by systemic racial inequality. Nor is it about saving students. So, practicing protective care is to safeguard students' potential, because all young people need someone to look out for them and have their backs, quoting Love's 2019 book. Anti-racist teachers prepare students to protect themselves, as well as supporting students' capacity to resist these institutional, interpersonal, and even internalized racisms, and helping them achieve at a higher level despite having to navigate an inequitable education system. And so that brings me to deep connection. Cultural and social connection to students, their families, their communities. It's fundamental to practicing protective care. Although racial identity doesn't determine connectedness, often connections form organically because of common experiences. Kinship, shared histories, those shared experiences. We distinguish these kinds of connections from individual teacher-student connections, where, for instance, a teacher might survey at the start of the school year to glean their likes and dislikes, their hobbies, basic facts. And these kind of pre-assessments are touted as best practices in building classroom community at the start of the school year. They're quick, they provide snapshots of students' individual interests at a particular moment in time. So like as an icebreaker, this may be fine. However, it's not an adequate basis for connected teaching, because it views the person with little or no context, right? This is akin to viewing a work of art out of context. There's a strong likelihood we will misinterpret what we see and miss what is most significant in their lives. Okay, and so I'm going to move to witnessing. Anti-racist pedagogy is a practice of witnessing as well. To witness is to remember rather than to hide from history, right? And this is going to be really important as I move through my slides to speak about the literacy that we must acquire. So it's remembering rather than hiding from history, and thinking about our inherited racial traumas, traumas of displacement, traumas of enslavement, genocide, police brutality, and other contemporary horrors. So at the same time, we bear witness when we emphasize the desires of strivings of those individuals and communities who experience racism. Indeed, creative cultural practices are testimonies to the various ways marginalized people create joy, goodness, healing, even in the midst of pain and struggle. Witnessing through art can inspire feeling, which can incite learning. It does not end there. Witnessing is professional obligation or a course of action that extends beyond the four walls of the classroom. It calls for art educators to acknowledge the truth of students' experiences with racism in and out of schools. And it means being present side by side with students and their communities, specifically students of color, in larger social movements and social movements for racial and educational justice. So these 4 C's, we call them clarity, connection, connectedness, and courage to witness. They come together when implementing anti-racist pedagogy. So I've presented this framework for you, but however, it's important to understand that there's some education, some acquisition of literacy that must be had by a teacher in order to engage and embody this framework for abolitionist work. It's critical to become knowledgeable about racism, how it affects your life, and what teaching art as a form of racial justice actually entails. What are those 4 C's again? So in the framework, you see protective care, and we've just bolded the C's. So protective care, deep connection, courageous witnessing, and political clarity. All right, so you can move to the next one. Ashley, thank you. So as we moved through, that framework, it's important to understand the acquisition of visual racial literacy. And I'm going to break this down because the thing that I've noticed about people who are just starting this work is they want to jump to the front of the line to start the work. There's really no foundation being acquired, that historical sociological toolkit that we're going to talk about to actually do this kind of work in a meaningful way that doesn't do more harm than good. So I'm going to introduce to you today this literacy that and when I say we, I'm giving honor to my co-author in our book. The book is called Race in Art Education, and can put it's not out yet, but you can put on a list for it to come out when it comes out. But I want to make sure I honor her when I'm using this work. And so we, think about visual racial literacy. And you see here, you have visual plus visual racial literacy. And I just have a simple quote by Bell Hooks that says, "There is power in looking." And so that goes back to the ways that arts and visual culture, imagery have established how we even have come to this, like the caste system based on race, the things that were put in the front of our eyes, our ways of engaging in the world from the beginning to establish these things. So this is the first step into doing this work, is to getting the buy-in, getting the understanding that, art has been a part of the ways that we understand race, which means it can be a part of the ways we destabilize racism, right? And so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. All right, so as you saw in the previous slide, it was visual plus visual racial literacy. So I'm going to break it down a little bit. So visual literacy is the ability to interpret, negotiate, and make meaning from information presented in the form of an image, extending the meaning of literacy, which commonly signifies interpretation of a written or printed text. So visual literacy, it impacts our decision-making, it impacts our learning. It's key to our communication, and not just as art teachers and art educators, but as humans. We live in a culture that is visually bombarded, that is visual. We're bombarded by imagery in our homes, in our cities, in our towns, and every aspect of our lives. So we have to be able to decode what we see and what it means, because so many things that are communicated, they're through pictures. So visual literacy allows us to read media and read our reality through a visual lens. And so can you go to one click on the next slide? So activating our visual literacy, we know how to, you can click the next slide, drive, right? Like those symbols, we know how to engage on a road trip because we know what these symbols look like. And that's because that is engaging our visual literacy. That's engaging the way that we decode and understand the world. It's also how we know how to do this. Click. Put together IKEA furniture. The dreaded IKEA furniture that only has images, right? Like I love a good IKEA shelf, but I can't stand putting it together. But that activates our visual literacy. It's our ability to translate and understand the world. And so just like any kind of literacy though, it's a lifelong practice of encoding and decoding. And so I'm gonna move to the next portion of visual racial literacy, and that is racial literacy. Because if you don't consider the race in visual literacy, that's a colorblind ideology, right? We have to understand how to read the world through a racial lens, because in the US specifically, we are racialized, everybody is. So racial literacy is the capacity to recognize, decode, and critically interpret the various forms and methods by which racism is communicated, from overtly vicious to polite expressions. The acquisition of racial literacy means that one has the ability to read the grammar of race. Like that is a phrase that critical race theory Lani Guinier says. You know, she likens it to a grammar. It's a grammar of race. It allows us to, like visual literacy, it develops over time. Guinier also says, always the meaning of race needs to be interrogated and conjugated carefully in light of relevant local circumstances and their historic underpinnings. And so you'll see on the right here, I have a quote by also a critical race theorist, Ruha Benjamin. And she says that without language to make sense of the worlds we've inherited and unwittingly produce, we graduate people who can't read their reality. Racial literacy is not about acquiring the words to have a conversation on race, which too often stay at the level of anecdote and sentiment. Racial literacy is about developing an historical and sociological toolkit to understand how we got here and how it could have been and can be otherwise. And so the way that art intersects with that is, you know, it plays a huge part in how we, understand history. It should be a part of our sociological toolkit. If you go to the next slide, that's great. All right, so, without the consideration of race, when we think about literacy, like I said, it's a color mute. You're being color mute on the subject of race. So we must reject these color mute practices as artists, as art educators. The absence of the consideration of race turns our attention away from systemic racism that we all named, thereby actually contributing to its maintenance. Okay, so, we want to have the ability to perceive, decode, comprehend, and articulate racism in its various manifestations. And so that's why me and my colleague define visual racial literacy as the critical creative, and ethical skills needed to interpret and respond to the visual culture of racism. And so I'm going to take you a little bit through some of these things and allow you to engage with some very interesting visual encounters, and actually share with you the historical foundation from how we can start to engage with this material through a visual racial lens. Okay, next. One more. All right, so in the chat, can you just put what you see here? Just describe the things that you see in the chat, and I'll call out some things here. Not a trick question. This is actually, I'm going to tell you what it is, and you can describe it. It's actually a kids menu from the Cracker Barrel. That's all I'll tell you. Okay, see some text, mom and dad, brown face at the bottom. All right. The black child is last. Billy at the bottom. 3 out of the 5 are white. Only 1 black child. The black baby is talking about dessert. Several light-skinned children. Any more? The black child is next to the food without the most nutrients. Okay. Top to bottom shows subliminal hierarchy, Anglo names, brown face at the bottom with the item that is not as nutrient. All Anglo names, black child eating dessert. Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna give you some context for Cracker Barrel as well. So Cracker Barrel, if you don't know, has been in the limelight in the past, that they were, being called racist. Not only the employees were claiming racism, but also people who visited the space. So as a designer, I could see Cracker Barrel saying, I'm gonna create a menu that shows that we think about equity, we're multicultural, everyone is included. We're gonna show that we care about all people, right? And so they have Sam, they have David, Jill, Ashley, Billy. They have the whole color of the rainbow, right? Can you click to the next slide, please? So as we think about this menu, I want you also to think about this piece of racial iconography here. This visual system that was developed to give racist ideas of air of truth, right? So this is called a casta. This is actually a painting that was made famous in New Spain. It comes from between 1700s, 1800s. They were a popular art form in New Spain. And so each human type was accompanied by a label that referred to a phenotype and cultural traits, right? So in addition to dividing humans into types, racial taxonomies were hierarchical. And you can see that. The Costa's paintings were organized as a progression from lighter to darker skin figures. The eye quickly kind of grasps that lighter skin and represents a higher social status, the power and the privilege through its placement on this visual plane. And so figures were commonly arranged in a grid, with each compartment numbered from 1 to 16. They were originally displayed in museums, government offices, universities, and actually we see that Costa's paintings teach the viewers to associate darker skin with lower positioning. You can see the clothes, you can see varying different traits that, represent a caste system, right? The problem with this menu is, okay, I understand that you may want to create a diverse or multicultural menu, but you don't have this visual racial literacy. You don't have this acquisition of a historical and sociological toolkit that you should have gotten in art school or even earlier. And so you have designers out here not building things that don't have the continuity from a historical platform, and you're really reaffirming a racist hierarchical status, right? A very clear caste system that looks exactly like this caste is painting from the 1700s, right? And so this is why it's important to, you cannot jump over a historical racial iconography if you are attempting in your teaching practices to build and build an abolitionist framework, to build anti-racist pedagogy. All right, so can you move to the next one, please? One more. Here's another example of contemporary discontinuity, not thinking about a historical foundation. Can you go to the next one? And this is a propaganda poster. The problematics with this one, you probably can see it very easily. There is research that shows even to this day, white people and other people from other races have associated Black people, particularly Black men, with apes, gorillas, monkeys. We saw a young Black boy have a shirt on from, I forgot what company it was. It said the best kind of monkey on the playground or something like that. And it was an outrage because there's a lack of a toolkit, historical toolkit, that is filled with this racial iconography that teaches us who to police. It teaches us who is angry. It teaches us that we can shoot Black men unarmed and we can call them and we can say we were in fear. People may actually be in fear. White people, white police specifically, I'm talking about, white police may actually be feeling like they are in fear because of there has been a historical precedent for creating this narrative through the visual, right? Okay. Yeah, somebody said H&M. Thank you for that. All right, one more example here. Anybody remember this? This Gucci sweater that came out. There's not a lot I need to say here. Can you click the next slide? There is a very close association with, this was supposed to be like a ski sweater. There's a very close association with blackface here. And this came out, it was pulled from the shelves immediately because of the outrage. But for a designer to design this and it actually get past the designing floor is a very clear, conclusion that there is a lack of continuity when we engage in arts pedagogy, supporting students in the classroom to understand this historical legacy that the arts built, right? So that's the, let me see, that's the last example I have. So can you go to the next one? We're gonna take a little processing break. So in the chat, if you wanna raise your hand to speak out, how has this information connected to what you already knew, extended what you knew, or challenged what you knew? Raven raised her hand.
Hi, my name is Raven Cook. I'm from Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. I have been encouraging my colleagues to really think about this, and I'm so grateful that you put language with it in a way that I can share with my contemporaries. I knew quite a bit of this, but I'm also really intrigued by the way you took the menu and paired it with the Costa painting. I think that was an incredibly powerful connection. Thank you for sharing that. But yeah, I think most of this information I knew, but I was definitely challenged by thinking of it in a way with language. Once you have language, you can then kind of break some of these narratives. You won't have to feel like you're being gaslit all the time when you're explaining it and you're like, I know what I'm saying, but no one's listening. This is so great. I'm so grateful. Thank you for this.
Thank you. And you really bring up a point where people who advocate for anti-racism and abolitionist practices, and especially if you're in a body that is marginalized, that has been marginalized or minoritized, people will challenge you because they think you have an agenda, right? Like there's this thing, like we're always speaking from emotion, but when you, just like you said, when you have the actual historical knowledge, when you place it in a frame that's like, this is fact, these are facts, this is not coming from an emotional place. It does come from an emotional place, but there is information outside of that that can support me. Then your work is, people may listen a little bit more because they see it as something not connected to you, as if it doesn't connect to you or them, you know. So there are strategies for doing this work, especially when you are, you know, trying to get buy-in from other people. So I am reminded of how anti-Blackness is pervasive, ingrained in American culture, but also global and embedded in colonial history. Thank you. It challenges me to encourage and advocate this information and language in a way that is meaningful. Thank you for this articulate literacy to counter institutionalism discussions when artists push back on embedded bias, not just angry Black women. Yes, that's exactly right. Seeing these images makes the ties to history of racial oppression in our country inescapable. Yes, exactly. Thank you for sharing those. I have just a little bit of time left, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump through this practice and show one more example of continuity that can be advocated for as we think about the development of tropes, right? So tropes are these rehearsed, reoccurring strips that place specific groups, specifically groups of color, into a specific ideal, and doesn't allow us to be anything outside of that. So can you click to the next one? So this woman, her name is Sarah Baartman. She was from South Africa, a 16-year-old, and her husband was murdered by Dutch colonists, and soon after she was sold into slavery to a Dutch trader. She was actually exhibited for entertainment at so-called freak shows. And so you can move to the next one, thank you. Baartman was dressed in feathers and beads and put on display for European onlookers to actually pay. And if you look at this image, they were interested in her enlarged butt, right? Her protruding buttocks. And she was promoted as the Hottentot Venus. And so the Hottentot refers to the group, the ethnic group which Baartman belonged to, but adding the word Venus, like initially off the top of your head, what comes to mind when you think of Venus? I'm not gonna wait for the chat, but put your ideas in the chat. For me, I'm hoping, you know, you think about Venus de Milo, goddess of beauty, goddess of sexuality, yes, Greek goddess, allure. And so if you think about the marrying of Hottentot and Venus, this juxtaposition actually dehumanizes and marginalizes her even more so, because it is kind of a contradiction in the ways that they marketed her. You can see on the right side, this is actually a flyer showing that she will be, you know, transferred around, or who will travel around Europe for these so-called freak shows. Can you go to the next one, please? And so you can see here that artists were actually hired to create these images here to promote different events that the Hottentot Venus was involved in. Even in 1815, when she was 26, when she died, her brains and her genitals were requested for dissection by European scientists, and the request was granted. Her corpse was plastered in castor, and it was actually displayed over and over again, but this time in a cast, right? In a cast. It circulated different European museums for over 190 years. And it wasn't until 2002 at the request of South African President Nelson Mandela, that a French government eventually agreed to repatriate her remains back to South Africa and bury them in an Eastern Cape province. And so this image, her image was now is widely, you know, Hottentot is actually a term that's widely derogatory, but her image became this dominant racial trope. This dominant racial type that actually visually encapsulated the myths that were created about Black women, about African people, their primitive, overly sexual nature of African women. And so her image was reproduced and circulated in these cartoons and periodicals and other different forms of popular media. And so they served as this visual evidence, like the other historical racial iconography that I showed you, as evidence that confirmed their own presumptions of white superiority and non-white inferiority. And so, next slide, please. That takes me to this image here, Taylor Swift's Shake It Off video. And this is just a still in the video. And you see she's looking up at this Black woman who was doing, you know, twerking and doing all kinds of dances and stuff. And so this kind of white gaze is similar to that in which we saw Sarah Baartman experiencing. And so when we think about Taylor Swift, this young blonde white American woman, you know, people are familiar with this song. Even my kids are, you know, it was on Sing, the G-rated movie Sing. And so they may see it on Sing and then they Google the video because they want to dance along and they see images like this. And so I want to make note, though, however, when we see Black women twerking and, you know, showing a lot of their back area, you know, if we think about Meg Thee Stallion, Cardi B, we can talk about the over sexualization of women, but we have to think about the intersectionality of race, because Cardi B using their bodies to do whatever they do and Taylor Swift using Black women's bodies are two completely different conversations. And so those in the intersection of race cannot be missed, cannot be overlooked when we have those conversations about the commodification of Black women's bodies, right? And so I just wanted to show that and then move along to one more slide here. Oh, it took you to the video, I think. My bad. So that's why, you know, it was an outrage when, you know, Kim Kardashian had this image, you know, on the front of this cover, and that's why it was likened to Sarah Baartman. Unlike Baartman, Kardashian has been able to capitalize on the public's fascination with her body and her likeness, both financially and socially. But when we consider that fascination is rooted in the same curiosity that turned Baartman from a human being into a museum display, it's not unfair to wonder just who is exploiting whom. Okay, so I'm going to go to the last section because I want to really emphasize the way that education is more than acquiring new knowledge and self-awareness. It's enacted in these daily practices. And one way to make racism a habit is to look at the instructional resources in the art classroom and make some changes. What do students see and have access to? Is it a colorblind environment? Is it attentive to visual racial literacy? Does it show a racial awareness? Does it invite students to dialogue about race, representation, discrimination, fairness? So try filling your walls and shelves with reproductions and books with artists, by artists of color, you know, photographs of artists, as well as even short biographies and a map to provide context. And so, but this doesn't mean just place any old artist on the wall, right? The artists that I want to share with you provide those sites of educational transformation that we talked about. So like sites, they actually use interventions. They use what I've presented to you here now, these counter visual strategies. So as we look for resources with our visual racial literacy engaged, we are looking for artists who are specifically working to destabilize the narratives that have been created through the visual. And so I'll move on to this first artist here. So if you see this artist here, her name is Tracy Rose, South African artist, and she's playing the role of Sarah Bartman. She's actually a photographer, but she's pushed the artistic and technical boundaries of her photography, essentially showing a contemporary response to the way in which Black bodies have been positioned. So how do you, you know what, I didn't go through the counter visual strategies. I'm sorry, let's go back because I need to respond to them. I mean, I need to note them. So when I say the artists, back one more, please, counter visual strategy. With the pink, you see it? Yeah, that one. So some artists, when you think about what artists to use, we're thinking about the ways they use recontextualization, the way they use juxtaposition, the way they use abstraction, repurposing, and reconfiguration of imagery. I'm not going to read through all of these because I have 1 minute left before we can start doing questions, but they use these things that push, they destabilize. So taking these items, resituating them in an unfamiliar context, contrasting them to disrupt the original meanings of each thing, creating them in non-representational ways. You can take a screenshot or whatever. I'm happy for you to, look to these counter visual strategies as you think about which artists to use. So, okay, thank you, Ashley. Now you can move to the next one. So when we look at Tracy Rose's work, we can see that she is using counter visual strategy. She's using the repurposing of Sarah Bartman's image. She's using reconfiguration of not only imagery, but ideas. You can see her in this pose, like she's no longer the, straight up and down figure who is being looked at. She is actually moving. She may be moving toward freedom, like if she's in a way to run. This artist is directly engaging with opposition of Bartman being the gaze of imagery. Okay, next one. One more. Okay, so here we have a daguerreotype. So daguerreotype is actually a technology of art that was used to, it was the first type of photography, but it was actually used to, through eugenics. It was used through the eugenics movement, but it was initially used to take pictures of very close detail, right? And so artists and scientists use daguerreotypes, and they used them to, some scientists actually hired artists to use daguerreotypes to note and take note of different features of specific people. You can see some daguerreotypes have grids behind them where they take measurements, very scientific means for using an artistic practice, right? And so when you see this daguerreotype, and then click one more, then you see the use of it by Carrie Mae Weems. She is very intentionally pushing up against the use of a daguerreotype as it was originally used. She's recontextualizing the image. She's juxtaposing and using abstraction to counter. She has text here. She has created a frame, like a lens. And so I want you to feel in your body the difference that you feel when you are engaging in the original daguerreotype and then the daguerreotype, the new image that Carrie Mae Weems brought forward. Can you click one? And another one. This is another one of hers. So how do you maybe share a little bit, share in the chat, and this will be my last thing, share in the chat that difference, that intervention that this artist is making, and the ways that you can think about other artists who have done this similar kind of pushing up against the narrative that were these myths that were created by the visuals. Anybody? Commentary on original to clarify the inherent racism. It goes from science to racist exploitation. Okay, I'm gonna move on through. Keep putting your thoughts in the chat, and we can continue this conversation on as we move forward. But this is another artist, Betty Saar. You see, she's reappropriating Aunt Jemima. We know Aunt Jemima, she's still in the stores today, but she juxtaposed her broom with a gun. You know, we know that Aunt Jemima, the character, you know, Black women were used to take care of white babies, breastfeed white babies, take care of the home. But then, you know, Saar repurposes this figure and places a gun next to it. What kind of, you know, pushing back, what kind of intervention is she making? One more. Can you go two more? One more. And I wanted to bring this, the previous one. And I want to bring this last artist here, Red Hong Yi, because she is, you know, taking back the image of the Asian American, the Asian and Pacific Islander community, as we've seen an increase in violence towards this specific group. And she, every day on her Instagram, highlighted a victim and recreated this beautiful piece of art out of these found materials. On the left, you see an artist, one of the victims of violence. And this is tea that she created out of. And then the other one, I think it's like some kind of seeds. But she works with different materials to create these images. And she created the I Am Not a Virus series. You may have heard that series as violence started escalating quite heavily in the Asian and AAPI community. And so my last slide here is just to, you know, ask teachers, emphasize the need for teachers to go for broke, like Baldwin says. This is a Baldwin quote, and it was in his letter titled A Talk for Teachers. And he says, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced from within. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke." And so this means, you know, as I go back to the educational structures, the systemic white supremacy that we talked about at the root of education and schooling right now, where is our sphere of influence as people who are on the ground doing the work, right? So, and what kinds of literacy do we need to do this kind of work? And what kind of literacy do we need to advocate for to not have people, specifically white allies, wanting to jump ahead and do this kind of work without having this, as Ruha Benjamin says, historical and sociological toolkit. And so I and Ashley, we really believe that it is the place in arts. And we saw how artists created these sites for abolition through their interventions. And so as we think about the tools that we need and the way that we engage with education, what tools can give us opportunities to develop our students' abolitionist heart and ways that they need to engage through the world safely for themselves and for others. So that's all I got. Thank you so much.
All right, sorry, I couldn't unmute. Thank you all so much. I just wanted to say to Joni, oh my, this really, I think, lit my soul on fire to just be able to have these connections and to have these tools of what abolition can really do in our schools, and the importance of being really visually and racially aware of these images. And so thank you so much. I wanted to just offer this check-in before we get into our questions. And it's something I like to do in all my presentations as we center ourselves in our bodies. What are you feeling, right? And where is it present in your body? Or you can even just check in this way. How would you hold yourself accountable to the learning that we have shared in community with each other today? I offer these questions. Feel free to share them in the chat as we prepare for question and answer.
Reaffirmed. Amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah. This information is priceless. I was taking notes. It was hard for me to focus on doing the technology because I'm here like, oh, yes. Wonderful. All right, we do open space for question and answer here.
Yeah, so everyone, if you have any questions for Ashley or Joni, feel free to put them in the Q&A. You can also raise a hand and we can put you off of mute. So we do have one question already in the Q&A that we can start with. It's actually like a two-parter. So I'll just read it aloud and then I'll turn it over to you. So our anonymous attendee asks first, what do we do when our students replicate this imagery or this messaging? And then the second part, this also makes me think of the term trauma porn that is often used when you can kind of tell that a teaching artist, let's see, irresponsibly mined a narrative or story because they thought it would make quote unquote good art. These are both tricky things to handle. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on either or both.
Right off the top, I think this makes me think of the artist, a white woman artist. Her name was Dana something. Can't remember her last name, but she was in a biennial. And Dana Schultz, thank you, Tracy. And she created this more abstract image of Emmett Till in his casket. And so she was a white woman, and she got a little bit of backlash. And her response, I remember one of her responses was that she identified with this, with the mother of Emmett Till as a mother on a mother level. So, you know, my response to that would be there was a lack of consideration of intersectionality, because Black motherhood and white motherhood are two different things. And so when I can't say that I've engaged with students who like try to recreate very specific kind of trauma porn like that. They usually create things that are around the topic, and they still don't quite know how to engage in it. But my responsibility is to talk through the process of conceptualization. So what ideas are you trying to portray, and how do you think they would best be portrayed to have in respect to the victim, the community that the victim is a part of, and while honoring what you want the world to understand through your art making. And so, you know, if I were to talk to Dana Schultz, it would be that conversation about thinking about intersectionality. Yes, as a mother, there is an experience that if you lose a child, that is a very specific experience. But when you lose a child to racial injustice built around very specifically the bodies of Black people in this nation, then that's a different consideration. So anything you want to add, Ashley?
Sorry, I had to I had to unmute. Our dog is barking. Yeah, I think about in terms of disrupting these images, right? It's also important just to name that this is either a racist trope or even, if we're going to call it trauma porn and things like that, like it's important, I think, to kind of just name those things as they are, and then why it's important to counteract these approaches to teaching.
All right, thank you both. So there are quite a few questions. I'm just going to move through them as quickly as I can, but we may not get to everybody's. So the next question is, I'm curious about non-visual art examples of how this has been done. Maybe that's for Joni.
What immediately comes to mind are, the hiplet dancers, right? So those hip hop ballet dancers, a group of Black women Black young women, we know that historically ballet has been predominantly white girls and women. And so even from the tights, the tights are supposed to be nude, and that is pink. And so the rethinking of the tights is brown, and also the hiplet dancers, they actually do hip hop and historically like African moves while they are on point. And so that's one example that I can immediately think of, the destabilizing of this narrative that ballet and white bodies are synonymous. And so shifting the narrative to include a foundation of ballet, but also a foundation of what is inherently ancestral in the bodies of Black people. And so I see that's initially like my first thought about example could be something like that.
Great, thank you. So we have two questions that are around sort of a similar thing, so I'll try to pose them both. Emily asks, do you have any thoughts on applying some of these fundamentals with young art students around grades kindergarten to second? And then another question in a broader sense is, how can I apply this to my teaching artist work?
Ashley, you want to jump in, or you want to? I don't want to dominate all the answers.
It's cool. These questions are for you, so I'm okay with just kind of letting you answer them. It's fine.
So artist practice and young art teachers, I would say in both instances, we may want to do an evaluation on something as simple as like color theory, a Eurocentric conceptualization of color theory. In the US, we like to think white, pure, kind of red, fiery, like the colors are associated with certain emotions in the US, but when we move to other spaces, other nations, those theories shift. Even when we think about the conversation about craft versus fine arts, what are we doing when we identify weaving or dyeing threads with indigo and very natural materials as craft, or quilting? Because those practices are at the center of certain indigenous peoples and native to certain groups of people. And so in the US, if we're shifting them to be aligning with a narrative that's like craft, which is outside of fine art, and we know there's a hierarchy between craft and fine art, like let's be real here. And so having that conversation with yourself as an artist, like, what materials do I prioritize, and why have I never worked with this specific material? Just experimentation, right? that is one way to engage, like be self-aware of all of the way that my decisions are being led by the things that I've learned or, subconsciously taken in. And so when I think about that same conversation can happen in a classroom with young kids, not prioritizing paint, acrylic paint or oil paint for a month, and we weave for a week, so understanding how it might not necessarily even be the topic of conversation. It may be in your practices. It may be what you place at the forefront of what and how you teach. So don't always think that your literacy needs to be in the form of a dialogue. It can also be in the form of what kind of decisions you're making and what they mean inherently when we take a week on this and a month on this, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's something too that we talk about too at the Institute, is that I know we like to teach according to calendars, but it's disrupting all of that and just teaching these things on a regular basis, that we don't wait until Black History Month to pull out the really, brown crayons, right? It's about how we're using these tools on a regular basis and how we're using this racial literacy throughout the year. Mm-hmm. That when it comes time to spotlight certain communities during these awareness months, it's doing just that, right? It's just celebrating them. But we've been mindful of the learning that needs to happen about certain specific groups all year long, right? So if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, it's an all year process. It's not just during Black History Month where we have to spotlight the struggle from, where we start from enslavement on, but it's really about how are we talking about all of these things, having that political clarity that Joni talks about all year long.
Mm-hmm. And even if it's like paint, making different colors of skin using paint and mixing, what are you starting from? Mm-hmm. Might you start, if you usually start from a lighter and add a little bit to be darker, mm-hmm. might you start from a dark and add a little bit to be lighter? Mm-hmm. So that practice is shifting the center, like that. We know that whiteness is normalized. We know even from the ways that Kodak calibrates their photography, that it was centered around the normalization of white skin using Shirley cards, right? So that center, and then moving, everything is outside and in addition to, but doing a different approach and shifting who is at the center and when, and what that might look like.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that's like a very powerful note to end this on. I do just have to note that it's 11:30, so we are running out of time. Is there any last remarks that either of you would like to make before Megan closes us out?
I said I was going to put my book in the chat. I'll do that. But did you have something, Ashley?
No, I just, one question I always ask, just how do you keep yourself accountable to this information, which is why it's in this check-in. I think it's just important for us to not just take this learning and, experience it for a moment, and that it's just a transactional experience, but more so how we're going to cultivate this learning and continue to improve our practices as we leave here.
Thank you so much for these wonderful questions too.
Thank you so much to our facilitators, and thank you so much to our interpreters. Before you leave us, please take a moment to complete this session poll that should pop up on your screen. Please stay after if you would like to join us for Show Your Face. It's a post-panel discussion with Wima Ragopala. If you wish to continue the conversation with us, please either raise a hand or write in the chat if you would like to stay, and we will bring you on as a panelist so that we can all see each other. Today, the Roundtable launched a new initiative. It is called Empire State Creates. It's a teaching artist-led activities for everyone. It's a new pilot grant program seeking to distribute $1,500 in grants to 15 independent teaching artists in New York State to create asynchronous arts learning resources for distribution in community settings. And if you would like some more information or to apply, there will be a link in the chat. And then join us today. We have 2 more sessions. At 4 o'clock, we have Sharing Power, looking at leadership structures. And at 6 o'clock, we have a community dine around, and it is in solidarity with the AAPI community. And so those are all my announcements. If you would like to stay for Share Your Face, please just raise your hand, put it in the chat, and Kinsey and Kimberly will get to you to put you as a panelist. Thank you so much to our facilitators. Incredible, incredible conversation. Thank you so much. If you'd like to stay, please feel free to, but you are not at all obligated to. Thank you all. Have a great day.
So I'm going to pull up Wema. I'm sorry, it's actually Wema Rahupala, who is going to be our Show Your Face facilitator today, and we are so grateful to have Wema here. So Wema, I'm going to, let's see. Oh, great, you're a panelist already. If you are ready to start the chat, I'll invite you to start your video, and I can pull you up as a spotlight. Let's see here.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It looks like my newborn wants to be on as well. I was hoping that she would nap. That's why I was nursing furiously through the session, but she wanted to kind of hang out with us. So I'm going to hold her because that's what she wants to be, part of this conversation. And first and foremost, I just want to thank Ashley and Dr. Boyd. Wow, what a wonderful, amazing session. I was so captivated by the work that you're doing, and I'm so happy to see all the amazing dialogue that was already happening within the session. You know, sometimes when people think about webinars, they're just like, okay, I'm just going to sit back and listen. No, this was truly engaging and interactive, and I want to thank you for that because it really brought the community in, as it always should. So my space here is to hold space, to think about some of the ideas that we listened to in the session. I teach a class called The Power of the Artist in Culturally Responsive Pedagogy at the New School, and I'm the arts education director at Marquee Studios. So this work is so important for us to continue to do and to continue to think about in every art form. And the first thing that I guess I was taking lots of notes. The first thing that really held space for me is there is power in looking. I look to artists like Bell Hooks, amazing authors like that, to bring out important ideas. And I wanted to hold space for that quote and also some other ideas that people were thinking about when listening to the session. So we're here to show our faces, to talk. I'm not, in any way going to speak for the amazing session that we already had, but we want to unpack some more ideas from that. So feel free to open up and let's talk a little bit more. There's power in looking. Let's start with that quote from Bell Hooks. Yes, our youngest facilitator ever, for sure. I'm sorry, I'm just getting into the chat now. I'm making sure I can see the chat while I'm holding her as well.
Everyone's also free, now that we're all panelists, come off of mute, come on video. I can spotlight you if you want to participate directly in conversation.
All right, folks. You know what? You're really funny. It's all good because I recognize your faces. So I know already some of you from regular face-to-face. So I know you're not afraid to talk. I do. So
Taryn has a hand up.
Great. Go for it.
Hey, so I know how it is like when you're teaching and everybody's off screen and no one's talking and stuff like that. So I just wanted to say something, although I can't say that it's like a fully formed thought, but when talking about the bell hooks quote of there's power in looking, I think that, you know, when we see images, when we see behaviors and things in the world around us, it communicates to us our worth, our place in the world, how things are supposed to be done. I showed an image of Frida Kahlo to 3rd to 5th graders the other day in an after school, and they said she looks like a man. And that's not something that, you know, like I was like, oh, what do you mean? And we talked about like body hair and choices around body hair and you know, things like that. But like they are looking at somebody and making a determination of like categorizing this woman as something in our society that looks like a man. So anyway, that's what I'm going to say for now and stop and listen to everybody else's brilliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I also want to cross the boundaries of art form as well. Not just thinking about visual art form, which is obvious in that quote as well, but even thinking about the looking in music, in dance, in theater, in other art forms that we use. What happens and how do we use that power? Because I think as we closed out, we were really thinking about how do we set ourselves accountable, you know, to the work that we know needs to be done, right? If we know that there's a certain power in developing our art, in creating our art, how are we making sure that we work to the best of our ability to dismantle some of the frameworks that have been in place for so long? You know, there was a work that I developed actually with my family in the latter part of this year that was called Listen. And it was all around thinking about how the framework of historical knowledge has always tried to separate us in different ways. But how do we move from that narrative to become artists that are thriving, to understand your purpose, to think about the issues that are happening within our community and do something about it and not just sit on the sidelines as well, you know? And the way we framed it was through poetry and music, dance, and also my son played the bass and my husband sang. So it was a little bit of everything. And this little one was in utero, so she was hanging out while I was dancing. So there's ways that we can continue to change the framework of things that are happening now, and how do we hold ourselves and our own work accountable to that?
Emma, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I forgot to mention before we started that our ASL interpreter, Tara, is only going to be available for the next 4 minutes, after which we won't have any ASL interpretation on the call. For folks who are using it, I do invite you to turn on your closed captions. They're automated through Zoom. They're pretty good. I do apologize about that. But we didn't realize until last week that we were extending this session, so we weren't able to book them quite as late as we would have liked. So sorry to interrupt, just wanted to make sure everyone knows.
Thank you. And thank you for adding in the chat as well. Eve, did you want to speak out loud about what you are putting in the chat also, or?
No, I thought there was another hand raised, so I'll just let it stay in the chat. It's fine.
Hi, thank you, Kimberly. My name is Basha, she, her, hers. I am a hip hop teaching artist, and everything you said, Waymo, was very, impactful, as well as like the session today, just thinking about how hip hop is also seen as a craft and not as like a fine art or like, something that is transformative. And I've learned so much on my own. Hip hop saved my life. And the fact that it is an expressive, art that can teach you 5 different elements that actually have a lot to do with, your social skills, like how you socialize with people, how you're able to see the world in a different way. So I think in reference to, the bell hooks quote, just like really being able to see, what we have tangible and not always diminishing that, and being in spaces where that is diminished as a craft, it's something that I have to keep pushing for, as it is similar to what people would call a Renaissance art, to just have, those who are not within the African diaspora who understand hip hop, who don't understand hip hop. I kind of say, listen, this is like a Renaissance art, because if you look everywhere across the world, there are people making street art to change their communities, to change how people see their, countries, and to bring aid to their countries, right? So I was having a question earlier. I was like, well, how do I unpack, or how do I answer questions or how do I educate adult, European or Middle Eastern, white, my counterparts or, community, when I'm pretty much like trying to teach, the youth and, reorganize my community to kind of like think in this way about hip hop. So that was something that I was really like thinking about throughout the whole session, was like, sometimes we don't want to educate, but it is, a responsibility that, you take on when you become a teacher, and you think everyone should be, I guess, open to receiving that, but sometimes you feel like when there is a conversation about help, or how can I help your community? And sometimes I think the help that needs to be done is internal, and that those who do not understand that marginalization needs to learn about their own history and how they've affected those who have been marginalized, or how, not they specifically, I don't want to say them, but like historically how a group of maybe like their ancestors have, just as we have had to learn our history. So that's something I've been reflecting on as a constant. And using hip hop is like the best thing. Like it's transformative. It has changed the way these children see themselves. I see, and hip hop is not a racial thing. It's not like, oh, you have to be Black to make hip. It is actually forbidden in hip hop to speak about, like, oh, you can only be Black to do this. Is actually like one of the rules of hip hop, because that brings community together, right? So I just really like using hip hop as an example, as something that really eradicates racism.
Yes. Use the art to eradicate racism. Yes. Let's hashtag that. Using art to eradicate racism all the way. That sounds absolutely wonderful. And thank you for sharing specifically how you work in your art form as well. I love it. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to think about the work that we do every day, and how transformative it is, and how we can take it to the next level. All right, next up is Karen.
Hi, good morning. I don't really have a question, but I guess more of like a comment. So my background is in dance, and more specifically in ballet. And for me, what was really resonating was just like all of the images, and how like there's just like a lack of knowledge of how these images really, impact us in different ways in terms of how we perceive, particularly like the classical art forms and, and whatnot. And I know for myself, when I was a graduate student at NYU, I wrote my thesis on this, about just like how different images of body image can kind of prevent people of color from wanting to participate in ballet. Just how there's like all these different, like, well, this is what, a person of color, like when they dance, like this is what they should be doing as opposed to this. And then also like vice versa. Well, I don't look like this, so I can't move and dance in this way. And just like how there's just like all these different things that are happening. And I just wanted to just say thank you for sharing all of those images and just like really talking about like how they, like there's just like a long, deep-seated history in it and how it's still prevalent in our culture today. And it's really powerful. So thank you.
Wow, Karen, thank you so much for sharing. It actually pulled me into like the idea of Sankofa too, like really looking back to move forward. And thank you for our presenters for really placing us in the historical reference to why these images became pervasive and why they're still coming up. And again, it doesn't just come up in visual art, it comes up in all of the artistic practices. We have to work on, I wrote down these 4 things, the 4 C's, they were so great: the protective care, the deep connection, courageous witnessing, and political clarity. All of those 4 C's were on point, because this is the issue that I'm finding within schools, within community, within teaching artistry, within this world. People feel like I don't know what to do, or I'm not doing it right, or I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to make a mistake. No, we are human beings. We make mistakes. Our work is to grow. So if you're taking the time to think, to ask questions, to think critically, to be in community, to be caring and making connections with folks, and to be courageous. You can't do this if you're going to feel inhibited. The work of abolition, the work of liberation takes courage. Our ancestors might still be in chains if folks were not courageous in the work that they were doing. And not only our enslaved ancestors, but people that were not enslaved, abolitionists, and people that are allies have to be courageous in all of the work that they're doing. So it's not just one answer. There's so many ways that we have to push the narrative and make our work deepen its field throughout the communities that we're serving. All right, who else is up next? I don't even know.
We don't have anybody just yet, but please feel free to come off of mute or write in the chat.
Okay, I was just making sure I wasn't missing anyone.
Can I just add that this coming Olympics will be featuring breakdancing as a part of it, so that's something groundbreaking.
Woo! All right. I can't wait for the Olympics now. I had no idea. That's great.
Hi.
David, go for it.
Cool. David here. Thank you for this excellent session. This truly was. And there are definitely things I learned, and there are things that I knew, but the way you presented and packaged them, like this is a better way to articulate it, but brought new life, new entry points, new ways of exchanging. So very grateful for that. And even and Basha, thanks for your thoughts too. And being reminded about breakdancing in the Olympics does 2 things to me. And it took me back to the session of that LeBron James magazine cover shoot. I definitely remember that. And I may not be a huge fan of him, but of him on the court, but off the court, he has nothing but my respect, But at the same time, I'm like, yo, your reach. How could you agree to that? You know what I mean? But the challenge of hip hop being in the Olympics is a challenge and an opportunity, right? I'm reminded of a quote by Grace Lee Boggs. I'll put it in the chat after. But the challenge of, damn, are people going to look at this just the Russian judges, they're gonna like look at hip hop breakdancing through like a lens they don't even understand, and then judge it by that lens, and then that's gonna be communicated to the whole effing world, you know. But at the same time, cultures. I mean, it's already global. You know, it's been pointed out already, so I don't have to repeat that. But it is an opportunity. So I guess it's just like a reminder that um, one reason I'm really grateful for your session among many is that you went from it wasn't just about theory. You really dove into how we can take this back and look into the reimagining and the implementation, not just the breakdown. You know, not just um, the breaking things down, or what this is what we're fighting against X. No, even the very last example you brought up with the paint really nailed, like sunk into my soul of like, rather than starting from white and making it darker, mixing to make it darker, start from black or start from a darker color, just reconstituting the center. What are we building? What are we imagining? What are we constructing? The scaffolding that we're putting around the educational system is to also build rather than tear down. And I love the kind of activeness and asset, you know, there are all these terms, asset-based approaches, blah, blah, blah. But I do appreciate that. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Right on point. Thank you. And that's the important thing to, sometimes it's a great thing. And sometimes it's like, okay, but what are we really putting our work out to be seen, and who is seeing it, and who has a right to say something about the work that we create as well. Thank you for bringing up those ideas as well. Alexandra, you're up next.
Thank you. I guess the thing that's resonating for me is not just how we approach our work with young people, but also in ourselves, as in terms of like professional education. These spaces are so incredibly valuable, and other adults that are in buildings with kids. Like I'm just aware that sometimes it's very hard to feel like you're swimming upstream, like you have a sense of how you want to work with young people that may not be part of the culture of the building that you're in, right? Whether that's a school or a theater or a company of some other art form, or especially when it's a predominantly white institution where we have often sometimes internalize that idea of what is good art, right? And what is valuable. And I did work for a while with a Latino theater company, and I thought, it was kind of wonderful to just vibe on our own and tell our own stories with each other and to each other. And if other people saw it, that was great, but that wasn't kind of the point. Or at least it didn't feel like it for me. And I guess there's, for me, the tug and push of sort of wanting to be valid in the world at large, and then also saying that I don't actually need you to validate me because I know I am valid. So there's a little bit of that sense, right? Of I want people to feel whole, but I also don't want them to feel marginalized. And hopefully that art can help us figure out that balance, right? How can I look at a piece of art and say, I don't see myself represented in that, and let me critique it through all of these sort of ways of looking, and also how I can be an artist, and how I want people to see me as that artist. All thoughts that are spinning for me.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I just kept thinking as we've been having this conversation that the most important factor is coming from a place of authenticity, of your truth, of your work being honest and real to your experience, and that's why art has such a powerful place in our culture, in our lives, in our community, because when we tell our stories, with truth and authenticity, then people, we all see, we see ourselves. We're not holding up those tropes anymore. We're not, just staying in a space of racist undertones in everything that we see. Come to your art and through your art and with your work with young people, with elders, with community, from an authentic place of your own reality, from your own skin, and all of the stuff that comes with that. That's something that I think I'd like to leave us with in thinking about. I love this quote, David. So I'm going to read the quote out before we go. Thank you for putting it in the chat, and I want to make sure that we all can hear it out loud. This is by Grace Leebox. The time has come for us to reimagine everything. We have to reimagine work and go away from labor. We have to reimagine revolution and get beyond protests. We have to think not only about change in our institutions, but change in ourselves. We are at the stage where the people in charge of the government and industry are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. It's up to us to reimagine the alternatives and not just protest against them and expect them to do better. Grace Leebox, great work. I love this, show your face session, this time for us to see each other. I wish we could sit and have lunch together and just chat like we normally do over the big tables. And one day we will soon. But thank you for having me. Thank you for having both of us, Maya and I. She's nursing now, so she was just like, okay, I'm hanging out for this whole session with all of us.
Thank you, Wimma, so much. And thanks again to Ashley and Dr. Joni. We just appreciate you. I mean, words can't express. This session was incredible. So everyone, I'll be sending out an email within the next few days with a link to the recording and all of these incredible resources in the chat. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you later today at 4:00 for Sharing Power. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, everyone.